I am Jacob Muller. I am a PhD candidate at the University of Minnesota in the Forest Resources Department in the Twin Cities. I'm also working here at CSU as an affiliate, as well as an instructor in the MNRS program. Sometime during my undergraduate experience, I took a forestry course. I was immediately drawn to it, this idea that it's an art and a science, that we can take all this information that we have about tree physiology and tree biology and forest ecology and apply that to our management decisions to ultimately meet our management objectives. The specific focus of my research is looking at short and long-term forest response to adaptive forest management approaches aimed at climate change. I think climate change is one of the greatest challenges for my generation and future generations to consider, especially when we're considering the health of our forests and how we manage those forests into the future. For me, it's really rewarding knowing that this work is going towards this greater body of work that's aimed at adapting to climate change and ultimately managing our forests in a way that will promote health and sustainability into the future.
Good afternoon. My name is Aaron Whiteheis. I'm a master's student here at CSU in the Department of Rangeland and Forestry. I'm here to introduce our next speaker, Jacob Muller. Jacob is a PhD candidate at the University of Minnesota in the Department of Forest Resources. His research is focused on seedling response to predicted suitable habitats under projected future climate, as well as modeling response to adaptive treatments. With that, welcome, Jacob.
All right. Thank you, Aaron, for the introduction. Thanks, Karina, for inviting me to talk, and thank you all for being here. So I'm going to continue on with kind of this theme of adaptive silviculture for climate change, and as Linda mentioned, kind of take us on a journey to Minnesota. So today, I'm going to talk to you a bit about adaptive forest management, especially in the context of climate change in Minnesota. The Minnesota Adaptive Silviculture for Climate Change project, and then discuss some of the research that we're getting into with regards to microclimate and seedling growth and survival. So, why should we study adaptive forest management in Minnesota forests? One obvious answer is climate is changing in Minnesota. And along with this climate change comes this uncertainty in how forests are going to respond to rapidly changing environmental conditions. In Minnesota, kind of across the entire state, we've seen about a 0.5 degree Fahrenheit increase in temperature per decade for the last few decades. We can see in this little graph here that we've adapted from the National Climate Assessment. Temperature increasing from the early part of the 20th century to the latter part and early part of the 21st century. And so we see some pretty dramatic increases, particularly concerning in northern Minnesota, where this research site is, and also where a lot of the pine forests are found. Here we can see a little diagram of precipitation, similar time frame, but we see it's a lot less consistent. There's a lot of variability across the state, some seeing pretty dramatic increases in precipitation, some areas actually seeing declines up here in the boundary waters area of Minnesota and Canada. So what can forest managers do to respond to these changing conditions in Minnesota? One approach is to use adaptive management. And this being this dynamic approach, which includes monitoring our treatments or the effects of our treatments and decisions, and then modify our management to meet our desired future conditions and management objectives. And Linda mentioned this, that diagram for adaptive management that the NIAX folks developed. So with this uncertainty with climate change, there'll be some important considerations when we're managing and choosing species. Diversity and structural complexity will be key to maintaining ecosystem function. And some characteristics that we look for, or we're looking for in species and ecosystems include wider ranges of ecological tolerances, species with greater genetic diversity, species and ecosystems adapted to disturbance, those that are adapted to warmer and drier climates, as well as ecosystems with diverse communities and species. And these are all important components to really build up the adaptive capacity and resiliency of landscapes. So this paper came out last year. This describes the Adaptive Silviculture for Climate Change project in our first 2 sites in Minnesota and in California. Really, this project, I don't need to go into a lot of detail because Linda did a great job of describing it, but this project really allows us to kind of move forward with how we think about adaptive management in operational terms. And so one of the goals is to perform robust on-the-ground adaptive management to learn about the response to climate change through implementation of these adaptations that are aimed at addressing future environmental change. One thing I'd like to really emphasize is this important relationship that this project has developed between managers and scientists. This is kind of this foundational idea that really we can improve the research questions that we ask and the treatments that we implement when we're working together through these partnerships, and that's really what this project affords us to do. We just looked at this. I'll just mention that, kind of show on the map where we're going to be talking about way up there in northern Minnesota. Again, with Brian Palick as the site lead up there. I'd just like to quickly show you the study design for the ASK project. You can see on the right-hand side, this is really the individual forest types and the management objectives and approaches that each forest type is going to have these unique desired future conditions and management objectives. But on the left-hand side, we have these common themes across all of the treatments. And what I'd like to point you to, again, are these ideas, these treatment themes or adaptation options that we translate into silvicultural prescriptions. And so Linda went through these, but resistance are actions that improve the defenses of the forest against anticipated change or directly defend the forest against disturbance in order to maintain relatively unchanged conditions. Resilience are actions that accommodate some degree of change, but ultimately encourage this return to a reference condition. And the transition, where we're accommodating change intentionally and enabling ecosystems to adaptively respond to new and changing conditions. So we can think about it, again, on this gradient from this most kind of rigid approach of the resistance, where we're reducing the climate change impacts and maintaining current conditions, to the transition where we're really pushing that into this future condition that is adapted to the future climates. So now we're going to move on to the Cutfoot Experimental Forest. This is on the Chippewa National Forest in northern Minnesota, and the location for our first site, the Adaptive Silviculture site. A little bit of background about this forest. So this is considered this northern dry mesic mixed woodland. It was originated 100 years ago by fire. It's largely single cohort. The average starting basal area is 180 square feet. And again, there's some range and stand ages there. The overstory is this 3-pine system that's dominated by red pine, jack pine, and white pine. And we have some minor deciduous components of the stands: paper birch, northern red oak, red maple, white spruce, and aspen. And this forest type, from recent Minnesota climate vulnerability assessments, has been deemed vulnerable to climate change and other forest health issues. So we can look at this, these charts here, these tables rather. We can see that there's going to be likely winners and losers of future climate change or predicted change. And these are all common species found in Minnesota, in the region where we're working. And on the left-hand side, we have reduced suitable habitat in the future predicted by Tree Atlas model. And so some important species that we're concerned about losing potential habitat are red pine, probably the most concerning, as well as jack pine, northern red oak. On the other hand, we have some winners, potential winners, and those are important species to think about, especially when we're considering kind of our adaptive approaches, considering species that are favored to future conditions. And so eastern white pine, bur oak, white oak are all predicted to have future suitable habitats and will be important key components of future management. So I'm going to go through each treatment now, that this resistance resilience transition, and kind of describe some of our management objectives and tactics that we use to achieve those. And so again, the resistance is to maintain this relatively unchanged condition. And so our goal, our DFC, desired future condition, is this homogeneous stand, red pine dominated single cohort. We can kind of think about this treatment as kind of the business as usual type approach. This is how a lot of these stands are managed in this area. And so we thin this stand this treatment to 100 to 120 square feet of basal area, and really focused on maintaining the red pine component. The resilience treatments, we are really trying to increase the heterogeneity and complexity of this treatment, both compositionally and structurally, and include more future adapted species for the focus of this. But ultimately, we're maintaining this as a red pine dominated stand. And so we can see in our tactics, we have a lot more management options that we're employing with this. So variable density thinning, half-acre skips, and half-acre gaps. Those are each, I think they comprise 20% of each treatment. So we've got 20% skips, 20% gaps, and then the rest is thinned in this matrix to 100 to 120 square feet, similar to the resistance treatment. And we're planting in the gaps in this treatment. The transition treatment. So the goal is to increase future habitat or future adapted species and really reduce the pine component. So we're shifting to a forest that is more adapted to future climates. And so we're really taking a lot of that emphasis away from the red pine and moving it more towards these future adapted species. So our tactics, we prescribed an irregular shelter wood with expanding gaps, retain large diameter trees, the red pine that we did retain. Thin the matrix to 60 to 80 square feet, which is a pretty significant thinning in this forest type. This is typically what's considered the lower level or the B line of the management zone, which is pretty low density for the red pine forests. And plant future adapted species in the matrix and in the gaps. And we also site prepped using this disc, this HARO disc, across the transition and in the resilience gaps. This is going through one of the transitions. And so we prepped the season before we ultimately planted through here. Just kind of gives you a little example of what it looks like up in northern Minnesota. And then the control. And this is untreated. This is the baseline for comparison. And our tactic is to let nature take its course. This just kind of helps think about these treatments in a little, perhaps, easier way to visualize. So we've got 25-acre treatments. This is one of 5 blocks. So we have about 500 acres for this research site. You can see the resilience having quite a bit of heterogeneity in the stand with the gaps and in the skips. And the transition having much lower density, 60 to 80 square feet, along with the gaps. So planting throughout the entire transition and just planting in the resilience gaps. That's all. So we planted a number of species in each of the treatments, well, in the resilience and in the transition. And in the transition, we planted eastern white pine, jack pine, red oak, bur oak, and red maple. It's important to note all of these species are currently found on the forest. So we're not bringing anything in. We're not doing any assisted migration with this treatment. We're still really focusing on the red pine. The transition, this is where things get fun, in my opinion. So we have eastern white pine and a suite of oaks that we're planting, red oak, bur oak, and white oak. And then we have some new species, bitternut hickory, black cherry, and ponderosa pine, which some of you may be familiar with, perhaps. So I highlighted these because these 4 species are not currently found on the forest. White oak, bitternut hickory, and black cherry are all found in Minnesota to the south. We brought them up to Minnesota. It's not a major shift. It's one that's predicted and one that could potentially happen naturally in the future. This ponderosa is what we call translocation of an exotic, and it is not native to Minnesota. We'll get into a little bit more detail on that in a second. And again, it's pretty remarkable, but we planted 275,000 seedlings in these treatments, and we're not monitoring them all, but we are monitoring quite a few of them. And so this approach really affords us this opportunity to think about different species and kind of this gradient of climate adapted or suitable habitat into the future. And so we've got northern red oak on the left, and that's predicted to have declining habitat. Very similar species. We got white oak here on the right, and that's predicted to have increasing habitat. So a lot of our study is really focused around looking at these different species, how they perform into the future. Right now we're looking at how they're performing as seedlings. And again, with the pines, that's eastern white pine on the left, predicted to have potential suitable habitat in the future. And this gorgeous ponderosa pine seedling here in Minnesota. It's growing quite well. I don't know if it grows that well here in Colorado. No? Yeah, I think so. So let's jump into it, kind of the elephant in the room, at least for a lot of audiences in Minnesota. Ponderosa pine, you can see its native range being dispersed across the Rocky Mountains and in the west. We picked 4 seed sources to plant in these treatments. And this guide, this research really helped us focus our decision making. And I'd like to point out that ponderosa pine has been tested in Minnesota for a number of years. In fact, it's been planted all over the plains and up into Canada as part of these prominence studies. And beyond that, a number of private landowners have planted ponderosa pine in Minnesota for windbreaks, and because they know that it's a very drought-tolerant species that will probably sustain into the future. So, that said, ponderosa pine isn't this crazy exotic species in Minnesota, but we planted it for experimental reasons to look at species that have more drought tolerance and fire tolerance. So we selected 4 seed sources: southeast Montana, the Black Hills of South Dakota, another site kind of in the southern area of the Black Hills in southwestern South Dakota, and Nebraska. There is some pine forests in Nebraska. So you can kind of see we really selected from this part of the range of ponderosa pine. And so we're tracking these and measuring these and looking at how these different seed sources perform. So part of our research into looking at these seedlings, and where my research kind of gets, or where my research falls with kind of in the context of this, is looking at this microclimate variability in seedling performance. And so quickly, the below canopy microclimate, I know a lot of folks here work with microclimates, but for those of you who might not know, it's really moderated by the interaction of the canopy with light, moisture, and temperature. So modifications to the canopy have pretty significant effects or cause effects to the below canopy conditions. And so we can think about our treatments here. We have our treatments that we kind of translate into these canopy conditions. We have high density, which is this control in the skips. We have moderate density, which is found in the resistance and the resilience matrix. Low density in the transition treatments, and then a no canopy, which is our gap. So we have this kind of this range of conditions that we're measuring. And so our research questions are focused around that. And to what degree do the adaptive silviculture treatments influence the below canopy microclimate characteristics? How does the below canopy microclimate influence seedling growth and survival? Are there significant differences in seedling performance within planted seedling species, or the species of the seedlings? And for ponderosa pine, thinking about the seed sources, what does the seed source influence seedling growth and survival and the response to the climate? Just a little bit of warning, we're not going to answer all these questions today, but hopefully soon we can share some more results. This is the timeline kind of from where we started to where we're at today. We implemented the treatments in the winter of 2014. We did that site prep, the harrow disc in the summer of 2015, planted and flagged all the seedlings in our plots in 2016 in the spring. And then that fall, we recorded survival. In 2016, we had microclimate stations deployed, as well as 2017. And this past spring, we recorded seedling survival. And then this fall, we had a big push and measured seedling growth and survival. So as far as seedlings are concerned, it's a pretty small window. But we've seen some response to these different treatments already, and we'll show that in a minute. In all, we're monitoring 170 plots. I need to get a better map, and I apologize, but you can see here's one block, here's another block, here's a block, here's a block in the orange, and then the red. I don't know if anybody can see that, but we've got plots across all of these research blocks and then the treatments. In those 170 plots, we're subsampling 40 of those from microclimate. And so we went out and installed these microclimate stations, soil moisture and soil temperature, air temperature and relative humidity. And you can see here in this photo, that's an example of one of them. And I know Ed Hill isn't here. He's a graduate student in the department. He was out helping me, and you can kind of see some of these disturbed areas. I think he left Minnesota with as many blisters as he did ticks, but you can talk to him about that sometime. And then we took a number of very common forest stand measurements, DBH, height, to get at the characteristics of the trees and the stand. And along with our microclimate, we also took hemispherical photographs on all the plots so that we can estimate leaf area index and photosynthetically active radiation. So we're relating the light and the canopy structure really to these below canopy climate conditions, soil moisture, temperature, and relative humidity. And of course, our seedling measurements. We measured height, basal diameter, and the competing vegetation around each seedling. So we measured a % of competition around each seedling. Courtney Peterson was out this fall. You're out in the spring too, right? Helping with tagging and measuring these seedlings. So this is kind of the summary of the research. Track and measure the planted seedlings within each research plot. And we have 10 tagged seedlings per species, per seed source, per plot. So those 4 seed sources of ponderosa pine, and then each of the different species. So in all, there's around 110 flagged seedlings on each plot that we're monitoring. We're quantifying and assessing the below canopy microclimate again with those stations. We have 2 years of data with that. Estimating leaf area index through the hemispherical photographs and assessing the below canopy conditions of each canopy condition and relating that to the seedling performance. So this is just kind of a quick look at the seedling data. We're still working through a lot of the microclimate data. We got piles and piles of that, and it's going to be really cool, but you have to wait a little bit for that. But you can see kind of there's a story here with the ponderosa pine. It's kind of one that's kind of go big or go home kind of story. So we had some pretty incredible growth in the ponderosa compared to the other seedlings, other species, but we also had pretty a lot more mortality as compared to the other more native species. And so we're working on this. Currently, we're looking at species or seedling performance is being tested against these microclimate variables to better understand the mechanisms that are driving these the performance of these seedlings. And just some final thoughts. I'll read this because I get it right. So managing for specific microclimate conditions may offer us opportunities, or may offer opportunities for managers to adapt forests to climate change through the implementation of management approaches aimed at moderating potential adverse effects of macroclimatic change on forest regeneration and seedling survival. And I took out a couple of slides. I was going to mention some of the other work. We're doing some modeling work with FES and climate FES here in Minnesota, as well as down in the San Juan National Forest on our other site there. And hopefully you'll have some more research to share with you in the future on that. With that, I'd like to thank again Dr. Nagel, Linda, my advisor. Some of you might be wondering why I'm here. That's why. I started with her while she was at Minnesota. Then she bailed, and decided to come out and work with her after I finished all my coursework and prelim exams out there. Then my other committee members, Brian, Matt, and Rebecca, all at the University of Minnesota. Well, Brian at the Northern Research Station. And Courtney Peterson, again, for coming out and helping, and being a big part of this project. So, thank you. Couple questions. Yes. Go over it.
What was your pre-harvest species variability? Is it pretty much the same across all your plots? Or?
So yes, I mean this site is a very homogeneous site. It was one of the reasons why it was selected. Very similar basal areas and densities across the entire 500 acres. There's some variability. There's some areas with some more deciduous components, red maple and oak, but for the most part, it was very homogeneous stand condition. And homogeneous soils as well, very sandy soils. So, yeah, we had that. Yes?
Did I see your graph right that the survival on those planted seedlings was like 90% or better?
On
all the species that you planted?
Yeah, so we had, oh, sorry, forgot to do that. The question was, were the seedlings have that high of survival? And the answer is yes. There was very high survival for these seedlings. We thought we lost a number of them the first season. They looked dead, and then the second season we were going back through and we checked each of the seedlings as we went through. They're planted kind of on a grid in these plots. And black cherry, a lot of them we thought were dead. We're doing great this year. And so, yeah, that's...
Are they 1-year-old or 2-year-old seedlings?
These were 2-year-old seedlings when they were planted. Yes.
What's the background rate of survival? Do you think that's high? It's pretty good. Yeah. Pretty.
Jeff?
Given like the diverse systems that the ASK project is going across, are there any like major changes, there are consistent changes across the different systems that folks are looking for or expecting?
I'm thinking about how to summarize that. Could you say that one more time?
I guess just across the PIs from the various projects.
Oh.
That's the question for,
Yeah, that might be a Linda question.
are there any, like big consistent changes in structure, composition that folks are expecting across these diverse systems?
So the question is, are there any kind of common themes or changes across all the sites that managers are expecting or preparing for? And do you want to field this one?
So we've started looking at consistencies and differences across what the treatments themselves are, and we're starting to look at things, characteristics of the species that are planted and being promoted, and so that's some of those graphs about drought tolerance and fire tolerance and that sort of thing. That's where we're at right now. And most of these sites, the Colorado site is the one that has not been harvested yet. Jones Center is currently being harvested as we speak. All the other ones are implemented. So there's a timing component to this that we can't control. And so as we move forward, those are some of the interesting questions that we'll be able to ask is, are there certain species or silvical characteristics that tend to be better under different types of climate? And right now we can't really ask those questions yet.
That's good.
All right, is there any more questions? All right, well, that concludes our seminar for today. There will be no seminar next week, but we encourage you to attend the Front Range Ecology Symposium. Let's once again thank our speakers. And